I'm particularly thrilled to be here at this conference. You know, Desiree, even though I've only known you for a short time, I really appreciate the way that you take a big tent approach to all of your work, and including this conference. And I think the big tent approach is exactly what we need in order to achieve eliminating the systemic rate limiters, to bringing chronic disease and ultimately biological aging itself under complete medical control. And in particular, to do this in time for the majority of people who are alive today. So I think we're all familiar with the systemic rate limiters. Aubrey mentioned some of them, Stephanie mentioned some just now. But I think because this is a mixed audience, I'd like to take an opportunity to give a little bit of a primer into this field, and I think why the big tent approach works so well to eliminate the systemic rate limiters. I think it's also important to be mindful that the systemic rate limiters that we're talking about exist for reasons. Certain systemic rate limiters in some circumstances make sense, right? This ultimately improves the flow of traffic. In an airport that's extremely busy, this is a good thing to have. The problem is that systemic rate limiters tend to persist even when the context that motivated them no longer applies. And I think that we'll see that as we kind of go through the systemic rate limiters that slow down all of our work. So as a primer, because I know we have a mixed audience here, when you think about the kinds of things that kill people around the world and that cause suffering, even more importantly, around the world, if you look by the headlines, you might kind of get a picture that looks something like this. And you might get the impression that all of these things are equally important. But when you actually add it all up and rank order it, it's not even close. Things that get some of the most press attention, things like terrorism, conflict, they're not even close. And the picture becomes even more significant when you realize that these top killers around the world are all related. These are all the chronic diseases. And then when you take a look at the rest of these so-called other diseases, even there, you see that these infectious diseases are also related to the same things that cause chronic disease. Having chronic disease makes you more susceptible to infectious disease, and that's exactly what we saw with COVID-19. So even in this other category, it's even more compelling than this. And of course, we don't group these diseases together just kind of for convenience. There's a reason, there's an ultimate biological reason why we group these diseases together. The reason is that they all share root causes. And as Aubrey was talking about before, normal metabolism leads to damage, and that damage accumulates throughout our entire lives. It starts even before we're born. And if you wait long enough, that damage accumulates to the point where it causes pathology. And it leads to these chronic diseases and also the sort of generalized debilitation that we associate with aging. Now, we have known for a long time, and this is, I think, why the big tent approach really makes a lot of sense to me in talking about eliminating the suffering of chronic disease. We've known for a long time that lifestyle medicine can slow down and postpone the point at which pathology emerges. And that's great. It's great that we can bring in, that we can achieve many years of health span just with things that already exist. But the problem is that it's not enough. And fortunately, thanks to the work of Aubrey and other leading scientists, we now know in this century, we know that we can go beyond lifestyle medicine and we can intervene to address forms of metabolic damage accumulation that are not particularly well controlled by lifestyle. And we can develop therapies to remove. And this, I think, is the picture that we can use to achieve to eliminate one of the most significant systemic rate limiters to our work, which is public perception. If we contextualize it in this way, I think we have some early evidence that if we contextualize our work in this way, a lot of the things that make the more long-term stuff, damage repair gerontology, scary, it's no longer that scary when it's contextualized as a natural extension of lifestyle medicine. And that is really what it is in my view. Now, I was reading a book recently by an author I really respect, and this passage was drawn to my attention. And my views on this field and how to eliminate systemic rate limiters can actually be summarized entirely by my reaction to the rest of this passage. When this author says that the good news is that most of the root causes of chronic disease are treatable through diet and lifestyle interventions, practices available to almost anyone, there are two things about this that I think are worth examining. One is the word most here. One, I'm not convinced that that's actually true. But even if it is, I think that the use of the word most in this context, and admittedly, this passage is taken a bit out of context, but it belies the fact that most is not enough. If we want to eradicate the suffering of chronic disease, then we need to address all of the root causes, not just some or even most, even if lifestyle can get us most. And again, I'm not convinced that that's actually true. But the other thing that I think is worth vehemently taking issue with is this last part, this idea that these practices are available to almost anyone, because in my view, they're actually available to almost no one in practice. There's a reason, I think, why, let's just take the United States, for example. The average American has seen public service announcements advocating that we get 5 servings in fruits and vegetables every day. The average American has seen that PSA 106 times. The number of Americans who actually get 5 servings of fruits and vegetables a day is, small single digits. So, to me, it's worth thinking about, speaking of systemic barriers, it's worth thinking about, just on the first order, what are the systemic barriers to adopting lifestyle interventions that we already know work today to not just prevent but reverse some of the most prevalent forms of chronic disease, cardiovascular diseases, type 2 diabetes, even some neurodegenerative disorders. Doesn't it sort of behoove us to take a look at this disconnect between what we know and what we do as a society and examine the systemic barriers that give rise to that disconnect? Because after all, there are so many systemic barriers to healthy lifestyles. It's not something that's just available. It's not a simple choice that just anyone can make. I mean, first of all, there's affordability and geographical access. What if you don't live near an outlet that offers the kinds of, and I'm just speaking about diet, that offers the kinds of fresh produce, healthy fruits and vegetables that have been shown in many different studies, both observational and intervention studies as well, again, to not just prevent but reverse some of the most dreaded chronic diseases. But even if you do have access, geographical access, you often might fall victim to the plethora of misinformation. You might not actually have access to the information about what dietary patterns actually reverse chronic disease. Certainly the media loves to kind of hop on anytime there is, an outlier study that suggests that anything other than the whole food plant-based diet can successfully reverse chronic disease, and it just kind of creates confusion. I mean, and then there's time and just the general kind of cognitive overload and choice architecture marketing inside the supermarket. The point to me is that not everyone is affected by each and every one of these systemic barriers, but almost everybody is affected by at least one. Maybe not to the same degree, but enough to the point where, despite the fact that we have this knowledge of how to prevent and reverse these diseases, the prevalence of these diseases just keeps on increasing like this. And in a sort of a parallel structure to the forms of damage that Aubrey introduced in the early 2000s, this is a systematic approach to a biological problem. It's an engineering approach to a biological problem. And I think there's almost a nice parallel structure between thinking about the systemic barriers to adopting lifestyle interventions that we already know work, and the systematic approach to eliminating the root causes of chronic disease that are not particularly well controlled by lifestyle. And I think if we kind of jump up one meta level, we can think about what are, just as we can enumerate these forms of damage, we can also enumerate what are the systemic rate limiters to progress in developing therapies to bring these under comprehensive medical control. And that is why, in my view, our foundation exists. As Aubrey has said many times, again and again, we are humanitarians first and foremost. I would characterize our work this way. We initiate and support the work most crucial and most overlooked to bring chronic, i.e. age-related disease and ultimately the degeneration of biological aging itself under complete medical control for everyone, and to save as many lives as possible along the way. And by extension, we understand that we have to identify and eliminate every systemic rate limiter to that work and to its dissemination. Because let's not kid ourselves, the fact that lifestyle interventions are, in practice, in practicality, available to almost no one. I mean, I'm thinking particularly of the United States here, but I think this applies to many other countries as well. This is a foreboding thing. This is something we have to think about. There are a lot of people in this room, a lot of people around the world who are working really hard to make chronic disease a thing of the past. But there are no outside forces guaranteeing that that will happen. And there are a lot of systemic effects baked in that really make it difficult to disseminate even therapies that we already have today that work. So as a foundation, I think we want to be really thoughtful, not just about how we can accelerate discovery of therapies to go beyond lifestyle and comprehensively eliminate all the root causes of chronic disease, but also to the dissemination of those discoveries ultimately. And I think we have to be really thoughtful about that, because I think that the existing status quo, the systemic barriers to healthy lifestyle, are kind of a foreboding warning that we need to really think about this really carefully. And so when we kind of enumerate the barriers, I think, Aubrey and Stephanie mentioned some of these already, but funding for pre-investable research is certainly rate limited. And there are kind of perverse biases in the way that science gets funded today that kind of bias against really ambitious, bold, audacious research that might be very capital intensive and that might have very long time horizons. One way for us to fix this is to go directly to the philanthropic community. And that's something that we intend to do more and more and on a bigger scale. Because the truth is that, if you think about it, if we were trying to do this in the 1960s, when the United States federal government was seriously spending money on scientific research and technological development, that would be a hard thing to compete with. The blessing in disguise, I suppose, of the fact that the NIA spends so little money every year on meaningful research to develop therapies to bring the root causes of chronic disease under comprehensive medical control, means that there's actually an opportunity for the ultra wealthy. If you're an ultra high net worth individual, you can single-handedly change the course of history. You can single-handedly change the course of scientific progress. And that's not always true. And I think it's worth remembering that in this particular time that happens to be true. Regulation, of course, is another important systemic barrier to address. And as Aubrey kind of mentioned before, we are funding two really important initiatives to do that: the Health Span Action Coalition and the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine. Coordination within the field, sharing of IP, a framework for shared platform discoveries. These are things that can allow startups in our field, little tiny startups in our field, to compete and frankly not get creamed by very big established biotech companies and big pharma companies. Because oftentimes a lot of the reason why why it's nice to be a big pharma company, remember, is that you have an arsenal of IP that you can use not only to attack entrance into the field, but also to defend against infringement lawsuits against you, if you're a big pharma company. If you have that arsenal, there's almost a sort of mutually assured destruction dynamic. So I think we need to give some thought to how we can build up our own framework of shared platform discoveries and shared IP to be able to overcome that kind of bias that kind of favors established, big pharma, big biotech companies. And the thing that ties it all together is public support. I know Stephanie talked a little bit about this, and actually talked quite a bit about this in her talk just now. So there's very little, I think, that I need to say on this, except to maybe raise a point about the approach and to kind of hint at something that we're working on that we're going to be in the coming months very excited to share with the community. But the thing that I really want to emphasize here is that I don't think this is an exhaustive list, and I certainly don't think that the solutions that we have in mind to these problems is comprehensive. What I would ask for from all of you, whether you're here physically at the conference or not, is if you've been thinking about this in the same way, if you've been thinking about the systemic rate limiters to our work, and you have thoughts on how we can attack these problems, and maybe there are other systemic rate limiters that you see that you think merit attention, I would love to have a conversation with you about that and how we can, because ultimately this is not about one foundation, this is about the entire field. One thing that's going to be absolutely crucial on that point, and something that I'd particularly like to ask this audience to give some thought to, the connection between forms of damage as they've been enumerated in the hallmarks of aging and in other enumerations. I think it's going to be really crucial to make the connection between those forms of damage and specific chronic disease, specific forms of chronic disease. And that's something that we're looking forward to in June at the World Stem Cell Summit. Bernie and his team at the Healthspan Action Coalition have done an incredible job of bringing together patient advocacy organizations around specific chronic diseases. And the more that we can really make the point that in the specific case of each form of chronic disease, that and paint a clear and vivid picture of how these forms of damage result in these chronic diseases, I think that that's going to be very helpful to us in earning public support. We have had some early success on the regulatory side. We're very blessed that our home member of Congress, Rosa DeLauro, has got to be about the coolest member of Congress that there is. And she spent an entire day with us in David Spiegel's lab at Yale, learning about his work to synthesize glucosapine and learning about the field in general and this engineering approach to take on this dreaded epidemic of chronic disease. So I think that there's a clear opportunity for us to further engage members of Congress, and Dylan Livingston at the Alliance for Longevity Initiatives has recently announced that he's created a longevity caucus, which is, I think, absolutely fantastic. So I think there's a lot of reason to be optimistic here. So I'm just going to close with an observation about the strategy that I see for bringing this work to more mainstream audiences. And it kind of starts with this, I think there's been a sort of long-standing argument in the field of longevity that kind of derives from this idea that innovation is a one-dimensional spectrum that goes something from like the mainstream with things like shoes on the one hand and things maybe like quantum computing on the other, things that are cutting edge. And at first blush, that's reasonable enough. And there's been this, like I said, this long-standing argument about kind of like strategically what's the best way to talk about longevity? I think Desiree asked a question of Aubrey that kind of gets at this question. And the issue that I see with this is that you can argue kind of both sides of it strategically, but if this mental model is so great, then my question is, where does something like Apple fit into this? Because Apple is both cutting edge and mainstream in my book. I mean, you can love Apple, you can hate Apple, but I don't think you can look at the M1 processor and say that's not cutting edge. So in my view, the issue is that we're actually looking at a two-dimensional space edge on. And in my view, mainstream and cutting edge are actually not antonyms. I mean, things can be both mainstream and cutting edge. Things can be, so I think that the spectrum is really, from mainstream to niche and from derivative to cutting edge. And I think when you look at it this way, you can kind of see that all these things have sort of proper places on this map. And let's remember that most of the things in the world are here. Most of the things in the world have very little public attention and are actually kind of boring. So this idea that has been floated by some in our field that we can solve this problem, that it will automatically solve this problem if we take longevity, which is basically here. And granted, I mean, there are lots of, the longevity community is big, and I don't mean to paint with a broad brush. There are lots of different things, and some might be closer to here, and some maybe closer to there. But there's been this idea in our field, floated by some, that we can earn mainstream engagement just by kind of pretending that our work is boring. Now, no matter how you slice it, I don't see how that works. One, because again, most of the stuff in the world is here, so it's far from automatic that just by making something boring you get mainstream engagement. But also, how can you talk about our work in a way that makes it sound boring? I mean, is eradicating the suffering of the chronic disease epidemic, is that boring? So, I don't think this works. I don't think that's what we want. What I think we want is to take our place up here in the upper right quadrant, next to things like Apple that have done this successfully, and I think we can learn from companies that have done this. I think we as a field actually have a lot in common with Apple. Not today, but if you think back to the Apple of 1997, when the company was 4 months away from bankruptcy, and Steve Jobs had just come back to the company after a 10-year hiatus, and the media was saying things like, "You're crazy if you buy a Mac," because let's face it, it's a walled garden. The software programs that you buy for Mac won't run on your PC. Remember those days when you actually had to think about stuff like that? And so in the media, the general, and it wasn't just the media, it was just the general zeitgeist was you're an idiot if you buy a Mac. They have 2% of the market share, they're probably going to go out of business, and then you're going to be stuck with this, box on your desk that doesn't run any of the software that anybody else in the world runs. There wasn't an imagination in the public, among the public, there wasn't an imagination that technology could play a bigger role in our lives, that it could be more than just a big, ugly, gray or beige box that sits on your desk that annoys you while you try to get your work done. I think that in some ways, that lack of imagination back then, I think it was crucial to get through that, to cut through that in order for Apple to kind of earn the place that they have now in our lives. I mean, yes, they have done incredible technological innovation since then. They've released fantastic products since then. But if you think back to the marketing that they did to get themselves out of that hole, I think we're in a similar situation here, where there's a lack of public imagination as to what health really can be, to what it really can mean to live a healthy life, what the limits or lack thereof are on that. I think that we have a massive opportunity to awaken the public imagination to that. And I really look forward to working with all of you in this quest to not only wake the public up to this enormous possibility of the work being done in our field, but to, on the basis of that, eliminate the systemic rate limiters that slow our work down and bring forward in time that point in which we can look back on the chronic disease epidemic and the suffering of biological aging, and look at it as a historical relic. So thank you very much.
Yes, excellent, really close. Thank you so much.
So that was fantastic, Greg, and we had many different conversations about the rand various tributaries that relate to this. I wanted to ask you one question, I'll throw this out too, which is, might we start to reframe chronic disease in order to open the conversation beyond that as a biopsychosocial marker of some other things that are off in our world? And you know, when we've tried to kind of, the boring part really amuses me too, you know, we try to kind of put these in boxes. There's been social determinants of health, there's been all sorts of mechanisms we've tried to use to combat that, but none of them really strike you as being successful. That's one part. And the other thing that is striking to me that does very much relate to your graphic is this idea that we also have, and you touched on it, about democratization of resources. So there's all the talk about exponential this and the democratization, all the Ds. But there's some very bizarre idea that democratization means lowering the prices and putting a lot of stuff out there. And one of the reasons for bringing the conversation here into the Bahamas has always been striking is things for many communities can be in their backyard, in their front yard, and their perception can still be that they have no access to it. You can make it free and put it in their front yard, and their picture of the world can still be, that isn't about me, that doesn't touch me, that has nothing to do with me. So there are lots of pieces that I think you've touched on around chronic disease that cut into that. So really massively in support of what you're trying to do, opening up that conversation and igniting that. I want to throw it out. I want to defer my 5 minutes, 5 takeaways to really throw this out to the audience for a much more open comment, question stuff that's come up with both Greg's talk and Stephanie's before. I'm seeing hands. I love to see many hands. Where is Arnold with his microphone with the hands? So there are two over there.
Let me start here on the left.
And one over there. One in the back. Wait, I see you.
Go ahead.
Good morning, Dr. Kalei Philippe from the Ministry of Health and Wellness. You have given my imagination a quantum leap with even this diagram of putting us along with Apple, thinking in a medical, because you know the medical model is either prevention, sick, dead. And now it is thinking, how do we transform the minds of healthcare providers to start to think about engaging the public and in providing healthcare service that improves the body and mind? What are your recommendations? How do we do that? Because we need to engage healthcare providers. The public wants to be healthy.
But I might add into that, Dr. Philippe, and say, what might it be like to not have that space between healthcare providers and public? What might it be like to have the self-sovereignty, the reclaiming of our self-sovereignty, to own our bodies, to have a sense of our choice, our destiny, our future, and to have an engaged public that is so. There's a poem by Derek Walcott called Love After Love, and the poem ends with feast, that line, feast on your life, that your life would be so delicious, so rich, so exciting, that you would want to know about all the pieces that would enhance it. Like, for me, it was, the step further, what might that be like, in which the whole world of being a provider is shifted to, who knows what, something that's more of a guide, or what might that be like? And that that's what does it for me.
Go ahead. Thank you.
Well, I think you are far more qualified to answer that question than I am. The only thing I would say is that I'm not a doctor. I come from a medical family. Both of my parents are doctors. My grandfather was a doctor. When I hear physicians in my family and their friends say, it's almost kind of verbatim. They've expressed the same thing to me over the years. What I hear them saying is, I didn't go to 4 years of medical school and then 4 years of post-medical school training and then a fellowship. I didn't do all of that to help patients manage the progression of their chronic disease. I went into medicine to cure disease. I went into medicine to help people be healthy. And that is an idea that that frustration is something that I feel, internally, because I've heard it from, everyone in my family, everyone in my community. And the frustration that I hear, particularly from primary care physicians, that in the U.S., where they have maybe 10 or 15 minutes with the patient, it's not nearly enough time to educate, as in the true sense of the word educate. To your point, Desiree, to bring out what's already within, to help the patient to realize the resources that they have at their disposal already. It's 10 to 15 minutes is not nearly enough to do that. So what I have advocated for is the idea that just as a primary care physician can refer a patient to a social worker, let's say, if they determine that that's prudent, there should be some way to refer patients to programs that can do exactly as you're saying, Desiree, I believe, and leverage the tools of the lifestyle medicine that we already have to achieve health. In other words, I think we have to think about the healthcare system as extending way past the four walls of a hospital or a physician's office.
Yeah. So, quick comments from, I see Steve, he's got the mic, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. And it was very descriptive and very enjoyable to listen to. I hope you don't mind. I'm Phil Mykins.
Oh, Phil,
so I do beg your pardon. Didn't say, did I? Phil Mykins from Anti-Aging Systems. I helped co-found it over 30 years ago. Through our magazine and through our websites, we reach out to about 120,000 individuals around the world. That's nothing compared to Bill over there, and the work of the Life Extension Foundation is fabulous, of course. But I do agree with you that we have to educate the public first, because they will drive the demand. When they're hammering on if you look at any revolution through history, it starts from the bottom up. And I think when they're hammering on the doors of physicians or whatever, minds will change. So I do wholeheartedly agree with you. If you don't mind, I'll just leave you with this. Several years ago, some of our girls went down to the big health show in London at the Olympia. And as people got off the underground to swarm into the health show, they were two very pretty girls, so we had no trouble stopping people. And they asked them people questions, and the two questions were, what do you think anti-aging is, and do you want it? The first answer, and this is perhaps not surprising, was the most common answer, was anti-aging is something to do with skin and hair, right? Because you're worth it, right? So,
Thanks, Laurie.
but the second one is kind of funny and sad at the same time. So the second question was, when they were told it's more fundamental than that, preventative, regenerative medicine, do you want it? We had two common answers. No. Why? Because I'm too old for it. Second common answer? No. Why? Because I'm too young for it. We have to get rid of that confusion. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. We have something at the back. There's the last comment at the back, and then I think
Yeah, I'll bring that to the back here.
Arnold, I have no idea of the time. But
Yeah,
take
no,
it back.
we're going to make a short announcement here in just a minute. Here.
Okay.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed your talk, Greg. Fantastic. My name is Matthew Galogli. I am not a doctor. None of you want me to try and heal you. However, I have spent as much time and money mastering the art of business and how to grow businesses that you have in medical school. Okay? In fact, I've probably spent triple in my education. And here's the lesson I want you to take from this. You're absolutely right. anytime we try to take this approach of getting this information to the patients through the traditional medical network and trying to convince other doctors, we are dead on arrival. You have to take this to the consumer, and let's use Apple as an example. I remember when I converted from Windows to Mac. Now, can anybody here imagine a life without Apple? Can you imagine it? Because I sure as hell can. My life is a lot easier. But here's the beauty of it. This is what was missed with Steve Jobs. He was brilliant at being able to take the complex and make it simple. He was able to articulate why a beautiful machine that didn't work with anything else, that operated on its own, was going to make his client's life easier. How many of you have an Apple iPhone in your pocket right now? Is your life easier? Do you give a rat's blank about the technology? Okay, now some of you are like, no, I really do. Okay, but the common consumer doesn't care. What he did is he saved a company by making the purchase of a computer emotional. And I want you to understand that, because tomorrow I'm going to have the opportunity to talk for a little bit, but I want you to remember this. Don't sell what you do logically. Remember, and I'm an anti-aging advocate, PRP advocate, if I can inject it, ingest it, insert it, or rub it on my body, I have taken it. Can I get an amen from the congregation? Okay. All right? And I know, just one last thing. I'll just say this. Remember, no one wants a PRP shot, but they want to play golf or tennis again. No one wants to take anti-aging protocols, but they want to have a morning erection or a desire to make love to their husband. Okay? That's the business we are in. The science is beautiful, it's sexy as hell to all of us, but we've got to remember, if we're going to transform our society away from a dependence on pharmaceuticals, we have to remember that it's about the emotion. People buy the shortcut to the life they want. So, I loved your talk. I can't wait to talk to you more, and I look forward to connecting with y'all. Thanks.